The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello everybody, thank you for attending today's webinar. Please read what's on the screen. It goes over Dennis's background, his history. Also, if you would like to see any of the past webinars, there's a link there showing you how to see them. And if you want to hire Dennis for remote or on-site training, there's a link there as well. So once again, thank you for joining us today. This is Dennis Taylor. He did part one last Friday, and if you missed that or if you'd like to see that again, you can see a recording of it on vbaexpress.com on the video page. You can also see two previous webinars that Dennis did. One was on Microsoft Excel functions and formulas, and the other one was on Power Tips and Tricks. And I know we all think we know most of the things in Excel, but if you watch those videos, I promise you you're guaranteed to learn a few things. I always do. Dennis does a great job. You can also see him on lynda.com. He has, over 50 videos there now. You can also see him on the CPA Academy and the CPE Coalition, where Dennis does webinars where people earn CPEs. So if you're looking to earn CPEs, check out both those sites, cpaacademy.com and cpecoalition.org. All right, Dennis, take it away.
All right, thank you, Christopher, and hello, everyone. If you were here last week, I want to give you just a brief reminder of what we started off with. We left the webinar at this point, right at this worksheet. I'll come back to this momentarily. We began, and this will be really brief, just by talking about the idea of PivotTable and what it's all about. We started with a list here, and we said we reviewed the idea, the concept behind what it is you would want to do with a list like this. And of course, three things that come to mind immediately: features that are available on the Data tab in the ribbon are sorting and filtering and perhaps adding subtotals. Those are all valuable. But I brought up the issue of what we might do if, for example, we wanted to come up with a quick list here, as I did manually, showing salespeople and items sold by region. And if you're not using a pivot table, you're going to have to use formulas, something like this perhaps, a sum ifs. Not easy to do. And we pointed out the idea that not only would you want to be able to create a list like this, but you'd also like to have the flexibility of saying, let's change those regions to be customers or products, or instead of the salesperson, let's put the regions over there and the customers on top, and so on. And we showed how relatively quickly you could create a pivot table simply by clicking inside the data after making sure that you don't have any empty rows or columns in it, and then going to the Insert tab in the ribbon and creating a pivot table. And we did that and ended up with a pivot table, and we made a few changes to it. It looked like this and so on. So I don't need to go through every step, of course, but just a reminder that that's the data that we began with. Then we moved over to the employees worksheet, and its source data is right here. And this time we talked about different scenarios, about the possible kinds of pivot tables you might want. And we also introduced the concept or the idea that sometimes maybe it's better to have the pivot table on the same sheet as the data. At different times I change my mind about that, but you always have that flexibility. If you go with the default settings and create a pivot table, it's going to be on a separate sheet from your source data, and some people like that. At other times you might want to consider, as we did here, putting the pivot table on the same sheet. And we'll repeat some of those actions with other worksheets as well too. And in this particular pivot table that we see here to the left, we showed how we could relatively quickly create a list here that shows that the compensation amounts by department broken out by status. And we also showed how we could, either in a separate pivot table or within the same pivot table, get a head count by putting in the employee name as a values area field. And once again, pointing to the pivot table fields list, the all-important pivot table fields list, which we can resize, we can move around, we can dock it to the right by double-clicking its title and so on. But the lower portion of this is a reminder as to what's in this pivot table. Of course, we can see here, we've got status across the top. That's represented as a columns area field. We've got departments down the left-hand side. That's a row labels field. And those are the two fields that we often focus on as we build a pivot table. The tabulation area, usually numerical, but not always, is represented right here, and that's called the values area. So we haven't talked about the filters area yet. We're going to do that. We also not overlooked really, but bypassed a feature new in Excel 2013 about using recommended pivot tables when you create a pivot table. And we also want to show you today a great feature introduced in Excel 2010 called Slicers, a new feature in 2013 called Timeline. We also want to bring out the idea of a pivot chart, and also how we could use conditional formatting within pivot tables to make this data stand out. And we'll also show you an amazing capability for handling and grouping data by dates and times. So those are some of the things we're going to head into. We'll move away from this worksheet and go to a different one, off to the left here, sales by category. Now this list here, as I zoom in, holding control on the mouse wheel, you can see pretty quickly what's going on. This is the list here. I'm going to double click the bottom edge of the active cell, simply point out it's a little over 400 rows. So we've got about 400 rows of data, and this is a company that makes major clothing types, so we've categorized them into 5 separate types. And sales have been recorded here in different regions, presumably dollars. We're talking about the regions, the dollars, and we're tracking this data over a 2-year period by a quarter within each year. And sales are either retail or wholesale. So we'd like to make sense out of this. This time what I'm going to do a little bit differently than what we've done last time, although I did refer to this choice called recommended pivot tables. Let's actually use that. So as always, before we begin, let's say we've gone through the actions of making sure that our data does not have an empty row within it or an empty column. Empty cells could be okay. And if we have titles, they should be in a single row. Any other information above or to the right or below that needs to be separated by at least one empty row or column, unless we somehow want that data to be included in the pivot table. Remember, another quick thought too, as you're assessing your data, if you know the data well, you don't do this constantly, but occasionally just click inside your data, press Control A, and either scroll around to see the extent of that highlighting, or simply press Control period 4 or 5 times, and you'll quickly see that, yes, this is the contiguous list that will be gathered if we start a pivot table. Click on one of the cells in here, and this time we will use recommended pivot tables. And notice the description. Want us to recommend pivot tables that summarize your complex data? Click this button, blah, 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 and so on. So we'll do that. We see some options here. Now, I might or might not want these, but they could be a starting point, and certainly one of the advantages is if you just find one of these that's close enough, or maybe it's just the one you want, you can either double-click it, or if it's a bit too small, you could click it and see it look slightly larger to the right, although not really. You can focus on maybe a little bit better. Maybe I just want to start right here with this one. Looks pretty good. I'll just double-click it, and immediately we will have a pivot table on a new worksheet. There it is right there. It might not be exactly what I want, but it's fairly close. So I'm going to move region from the rows area into the columns area. And I want to track clothing type. Since it is a text field, I'll click the box for clothing type. It will automatically appear as a rows area field. There it is. Keep in mind, this pivot table's field list can be floating like this. If you double-click its title bar, it's docked to the right, which is fine too if you want to use it that way. If you'd like to undock it and make it be floating, just drag its title, click and drag out here. So different reasons at different times, personal preference really. Okay, let's zoom in on this and bring out some more features here. 2 things we recommend nearly always when you see a pivot table. The first one is most people probably don't want to see row labels and column labels. If you're working with the data and you're relatively new at pivot tables, not a bad idea to keep them there because it reminds you as to what the area refers to. Row labels, column labels. Lines up with rows and columns, we see it off to the right. But if we don't want to see those, the suggestion I made last week was to go to the Design tab, and under Report Layout, that's 3rd button from the left, click there, and choose either outline or tabular. The major difference in these two is that tabular puts in grid lines. And you wouldn't even know what compact form means unless you had seen an example where many, many fields are involved. That's when it comes, that name might make more sense. So for the moment, we're ignoring that. But when you choose outline or tabular, you will see actual field names. And I think that's what most people would want. And a quick adjustment of the numbers. Right-click any of the numbers, any of the cells here that have numbers in them, and simply go to Number Format. And here the best example would be to use the commas as the thousands separator and no decimals. So much easier to read. So we got about 6.3 million in sales here. We can zoom in and out at different times, of course, too. Okay, let's make a few changes. And I also want to talk a little bit about this area called filters. This is the least important of the four areas we see here, but it does have a role to play. And if you put a field in filters, and do nothing with it, it's almost as if you're ignoring it, which sounds kind of strange. I'm going to put year as a filters field, dragging year from the list up here into filters. Watch the pivot table to the left, and we have a new addition. But nothing has changed. These numbers are exactly as we've seen them, but we now see this up here, and so what might we do? Click the drop arrow, and maybe choose 2013. And we're not seeing, we're about to only see 2013. So instead of 6.3 million to the right, we're down to 3.1 million. We're only viewing the year 2013. And of course, we could have chosen 2012. So you can see one use of it here without cluttering up the main part of the pivot table. We're simply showing less data or more focused data. And I can press Control-Z to go back and look like this. I'm going to press Control-Z again to actually remove year from there. Do it that way.
Dennis, real quick, your volume's a little low there.
It is?
Yeah, in the last few sentences. I'm sorry.
Okay, let me check something here. I'm not sure if that's going to help, but let me go back here. All right, now here's another option. Suppose we did want to show year, but maybe in a different kind of a way. Now, you wouldn't know this until you try it, but I'm going to drag year into the rows area, and we see this breakout. Remember, too, when you've got two fields side by side, years and clothing, the way they are displayed in the pivot table fields list is year on top of clothing. If I drag year downward, it's going to go below clothing here, but in the display, now it's off to the left. In both of these cases, we see subtotals. Now, sometimes, and I think this might be the time, the subtotals maybe are unnecessary. We might not want to see them. So when you are seeing subtotals like this, you can go to the Design tab. Now, if you don't want to see them, the left button, Subtotals, do not show subtotals. So a slightly cleaner look. And I'll again reverse the order here. This time I'll drag clothing type below year. This is in the rows area, and we see the display this way. Now, what if here we say, I don't want to see, we were to say, let's focus on 2013 only. We've got two options. We can double-click the 2013. That's the same as hitting the minus. We see 2012 as just a single row without the detail. That's certainly a possibility. Or we can click the drop arrow here and unselect 2012. So here's one view. I'll press Control-Z, go back a few steps where we're seeing 2013 only, but with 2012 as a single line, looking like that. And then a few steps before that, I might not be able to go back that far. We saw this as a row label, and I think we aren't able to get back that far. So I'll press Control-Y a few times, reversing direction, going back to this display. So we've got different options here, and filters can be used effectively. But I want to show you one of the downsides of it too, and that is, what if I were to use clothing type as a filter instead of a rows area field? So I'm going to move clothing type, currently in the rows area, into filters. Now we see this. So as before, we could focus on one of the items pretty easily. Click the drop arrow. Let's just focus on pants. Click OK. There's pants sales. And we see clearly that it's pants. But what if we want to show 2 or 3 items? How about the so-called accessories? We want belts, ties, and shoes. Belts, ties is one, shoes another. Select multiple items. Click there. Click the box for shoes. OK. Now, our memories aren't that bad, but do you see on the screen what we are showing? We are not showing dresses, pants, and shirts. Now, do we always remember all the possibilities there? Probably not. unless you're really on top of the data, but what if we had 18 multiple items, or 18 items there? So we're seeing 2 items, but this phrase here, multiple items, doesn't exactly help. I guess it's a reminder, you could say, that we're not seeing everything. So you could see here, we're seeing belts, ties, and shoes here, 2 separate entries, and yet in the pivot table, we don't see any other breakout to indicate what that is. So I think you can see a downside to that. Now contrast this with, what if we were to show all here, and then bring clothing type back in as a row label, or row field entry. And this time we'll choose the drop arrow for clothing type. Unselect all, choose belts, ties, shoes. Click OK. So now we see the display that way. Now it may or may not be broken out by years, in this case it is, but recognize how now when we're viewing the data, we know which clothing types are being shown. Now, in all these different scenarios, I mean, you can imagine, once again, pivot tables are not really difficult. You see drop arrows, you know what to do with them. But when you're writing about this, and I sometimes get calls from people, they say, well, if I move this field down here, and I want to say, stop, what do you mean down here? And they say, well, next to the region or something. It's kind of hard to describe this using all the right words. And that's why we've got to see the visuals as we talk about this. So this has some merit too, but what it doesn't show us is what is not being shown. That sounds like a double negative there. In other words, we don't know right now, unless we know all 5 clothing types pretty well, which ones are not showing. Which ones are not showing. And what if we had 15 or 20 clothing types? Even somebody who works with the data all the time doesn't remember them all. And so a slight deficiency here, or maybe a major deficiency. You're the one doing the judging on this. So part of what's happened here is and perhaps in recognition of this, a new feature was introduced in Excel 2010 called slicers. So I'm going to go back here to clothing type and select all. Leave it there. I want to remove year from the list, and I'll simply uncheck its box in the pivot table field list to the right, and bring in these so-called slicers. And at first they're going to look kind of funny, they're going to seem unwieldy, but they have some real strengths, and you can use them starting in 2013 with tables that are not pivot tables, just pure tables. And we'll show you a quick example of that. So slicers, why do we want to use these? Because they're going to give us better filtering capability and much better for presentations. That's where it really is going to shine. So on the Analyze tab, by the way, in Excel 2010, this tab was called Options, and now it's called Analyze. I'm not sure why they changed that name, but they did. All right, here's our choice. Insert Slicer. It says use a slicer to filter data visually. Slicers make it faster and easier to filter tables and pivot tables and pivot charts and so on. Insert Slicer. Now, we can have slicers for different fields. I'm going to check more than I might usually. Clothing type, region, year, quarter, sales type. Click OK. And suddenly, we're almost overwhelmed with too much on the screen. What I'm going to be doing here is resizing these as quick as I can. And if you were making a presentation, you definitely want to do this ahead of time, because you don't want to be using valuable time as people watch you do this. Now, obviously, I want to show you how to do it, so I've got to do it here. So I'm making these as compact as possible, or I want them to be visible and all that. By the way, you could change colors on them too if you had the time and inclination and so on. I'm going to move these around and reshape them a little bit, and sometimes just don't get it just right there. There we go. And this one here. And I'll move these around in different ways. There we go. As you do this, sometimes you say, gee, I didn't know the text was going to be this big. You have total control ultimately over the formatting of this. And obviously that's not the most important thing, but people worry about that. Okay, so we've got a situation here, and I'm moving these around in what I think is a better way. Okay, right now our pivot table is showing, you can see, region and clothing type. Now, we saw earlier how we might want to do this for 1 year only, and we possibly could use the report filter. We could have done that. Remember, I'm going to bring this back again. The filter area there in the pivot table field, the area right here, Earlier we had year in there, and you saw how it appeared atop the pivot table. Right now, nowhere in here do we see year. But because we've got a slicer over there, I'm going to click 2013, and we see the data for 2013. And the slicer reminds us, and very clearly to it, I might add, that we're only seeing 2013. Now somebody else wants to bring back the idea that we saw earlier. Let's just focus on our accessory type items. So I'm going to click belts, ties. This is under clothing type. And for the moment, we're only seeing data for belts, ties. Now this is reflected in the pivot table because that field is in the pivot table. How do we add shoes here? We hold down Control and click shoes. And you can see the pivot table react. If we only want this for retail for the moment, we'll click retail. Right now, sales type is not represented in the pivot table, but nevertheless, we will affect the pivot table to show retail only by clicking retail. And if we don't want to consider Pacific in our list here, we can hold down the Control key and click Pacific, and it is unselected or deselected. So what are we looking at now?
Dennis, quick question. Why are you holding down the Control key, in case people don't know?
In case I'm holding down Control because I don't want Pacific. In other words, the others were all selected automatically, and I held down Control to deselect Pacific. Now, you do it in a reverse way. Under clothing type, if we wanted to add pants right now, we currently are showing belts, ties, and shoes. If we want to add pants, I'll point to pants. And since I don't want to deselect the others, I hold down Control and click pants. And now it's added to the list. So it's kind of hard to state in a coherent sentence, but we pick up items individually from the list or remove them from the list by using the Control key as we click. Now, in an earlier example, if we had done this by using the drop arrow right here to choose our items, we would clearly see what we're seeing here, belts, ties, pants, and shoes. But do we remember the other two clothing types? We don't have that problem now. With slicers, yes, we see that we're not currently showing shirts and dresses. And we're not showing wholesale right now either. So within the pivot table, we're only showing region and clothing type. And over here, we've got a clothing type slicer and a region slicer, but also three other slicers. And even though these fields are not in the pivot table, we are controlling the pivot table display. And I think you can begin to see how it works. There's always the reminder of what's being shown and what's not being shown. The X here means do not filter, or in other words, choose all regions. If I click here, we're going to see all regions. There they are.
So Dennis, would the shift key in this case act like select all, or no? That was a question.
If you click Midwest and then hold down Shift and click South right here, it does pick up the consecutive group. Now let's say you wouldn't do it there because you just come up here and click this button. So let me do it again. Suppose you say, okay, let's only do Midwest through Pacific. I'll click Midwest, and with the Shift key, I'll click Pacific. So we picked up the two between those also. So
it's not necessarily intuitive. So how would people, I mean, there's so many options. How would what's the quickest way for them to remember these?
It isn't intuitive, but on the other hand, if you're familiar with how you select multiple sheets in a workbook, if I want to select all the sheets to make changes, suppose they have similar layouts, if I want to check all the sheets from, or select all the sheets from this green tab sheet over to the other green tab sheet, I can select them all by clicking the first one, and then with the Shift key held down, click the last one, and then all these sheets here will be selected at once. If I had two sheets that were pretty similar, I wanted to change both, but they were not adjacent, I would click one of them, and then with the Control key, I'd click the other one, and then those two sheets would be selected, but no others. But it's the same style as that, but not everybody's done that. So it's a question of, I think, first of all, if you want no filtering, if you want every item to be presented, simply click the filter with the little X on it up top. That says clear filter, so we're showing all clothing types. If we only want to show a couple of them, like dresses and shirts, we click one of them, and then with the Control key, we click the other one. And we later come back and say, let's add pants to this. We'll hold down Control and click pants. At another time, we might say, maybe go back to region again. Could we just show northeast through south? We'll click northeast, and then with the shift key we'll click south. It will also pick up Pacific. It just saves us a step there. The other way to do that is we could have clicked northeast, with the control key click Pacific, with the control key click south. So different ways, different techniques for selecting these.
Well, thank you for going over that. I'm sorry to interrupt.
Well, yeah, that's a good question, though, because I make assumptions over time about how people have used Excel, and some people are delving into pivot tables without having used Excel a whole lot, and that's just fine. And you may not be aware of some of those other, more or less, maybe not intuitive, but at least sort of standard techniques. Now, once you get proficient with these, again, you can spend some time making them look better. You can, as you click on one of these, it has its own contextual tab. Under Slicer Tools up on the ribbon, there's an Options tab there. So I might make that one reddish and click over here and make that one green. And click over there. I'm right here under Slicer Types here. Make that one blue and come down here and so on. And, enough choices there to keep anybody happy, and maybe more than enough. But they're out there. So different choices.
Maybe in the future we do a presentation on slicers.
Yeah, and in fact, the other advantage too is starting not in 2010, but starting in 2013, if you have a table. Now, this is not a pivot table, but it's a table. It has that look that a lot of us are familiar with. If you work with tables, you know this look. You can go to the Design tab, and you've got your 61 other choices and all that, and this one, that one, whatever. But if you're doing filtering, and filter arrows are there, and you can certainly use filters in a variety of ways. Just to make sure that's all on there. It is, okay. But what if we could introduce slicers here? I only want to do one of them, but I'll insert a slicer here for, and there it is right up there. So many choices now. I'll do it for department and maybe status. Now, department has about 25 entries here, so and status is pretty small. But anyway, you get the idea. Very quickly here, I can click full-time, and you see in the background we're only viewing full-time people. And we've got a clear reminder as to which statuses are not being shown. On departments, you could make this be a 3-column list and then shape it, drag it sideways like that. But we're looking at all of our departments now. But if we just wanted to look at the training departments, I'm going to click Executive Education. And now with the Control key, I'll click Admin Training. And also with the Control key down here, I'll click Professional Training Group. And so we're only viewing our training departments. And we see all the others that are not being shown.
So it's very powerful. And real quick, for those that don't know what Excel tables are, not pivot tables, but Excel tables, Zach Barisi, the Microsoft Excel MVP, did 2 webinars on VBA Express. You can see the videos, part 1 and part 2, on tables. And then Dennis, I have a question for you. Can a slicer control more than one pivot table?
I believe so, not at the same time. In fact, what I could do here probably pretty quickly, I think. Let's see if we can jump back here. I mentioned last time that you can easily create another pivot table from an existing pivot table. So if I just select the data here, and I'll do a copy with Control-C, and come down here and press Control-V, I've got 2 pivot tables that for the moment are identical, but let's make sure they're going to be different. This one I'm going to put in year, and take out clothing type temporarily. Put clothing type over there, and maybe remove region even for the moment, and track sales. Okay, so it's done. I've got 2 different pivot tables here, looking different layout and so on. As I click in the one below here, now I'm thinking for the moment here, and actually I'm not sure if I've tried what you want here. Let me make sure that in this pivot table, I'm showing all years and all clothing types. This is about to bring up another issue, which I'll get to too. It looks as if at the moment the pivot table, let's see. Okay, under clothing type, I'm going to check belts, ties. Let's keep an eye on both pivot tables. Both pivot tables at the same time are being changed. Now the question that I didn't quite answer though is, can we have separate slicers for each table? And it looks as if we can't, but I wouldn't want to give a definitive no on that, because I could imagine, although it would be a little complex possibly, to have these slicers doing different things for different tables. Right now, both tables are showing belts, ties. And the thing I didn't point out earlier too, and I'll bring it out now too, even if we had only one of these, if I use the drop arrow here within the pivot table for clothing type and say, in effect, I now want to add shoes, I can do that, but keep an eye on the slicer over there in column H. Shoes is now highlighted. And in the other pivot tables, shoes are now appearing too, even though it's a column label over here. So I'd say proceed with caution there, but it looks as if, at least first glance, because I haven't really tried this, could you have separate slicers for different pivot tables based on the same source data? And it looks as if you can't. But a good question too, a good thought.
Thank you, Dennis.
Okay, go ahead.
Yes, please go ahead. Thank you.
Okay. So I don't want to oversell the feature, but I think you can see it's got some real merit. And if you were about to make a presentation, and depending upon your audience, of course, I mean, if the audience is people who only use Excel casually, and you don't have to give them the details on this, and if it's people who are in finance, and well, I imagine finance people do use Excel pretty much, but there could be a certain kind of audience that you wouldn't want to show them how these appeared here, but just have them there ahead of time. And we think about that sometimes when we make presentations. How much detail, how much about the inner workings of Excel need we show people? You could have these present ahead of time and then start to use them, but it's your call on how best to do that. But I think you can see, again, I don't want to oversell it, but I think this is a great feature. And it does provide that missing information that filters alone don't help us with. We want to know not only what we are seeing, but what is currently being hidden. We want to know that, and this brings it out beautifully in a good visual way.
So it's also a great way to go into your boss and give them this pivot table with the slicers, and they can do their own analysis once they learn how to use it. So it can make you look very good, because this is actually very sharp and powerful.
The manager could say, "It's so easy, even I can do it." Right?
Yeah.
if the person is self-deprecating enough. So. Okay, some other things we want to show here too. Let's see, we go back here. All along, we could have had a pivot chart accompany the data. Now, to unclutter the screen a little bit here, because recognize we do have a busy screen that's going to get even busier. I'm going to remove this lower pivot table down here, and possibly I could just delete the rows. That would do it. There's nothing else on the worksheet down here, so I'll just slide down here, right-click, and delete these rows to get rid of that pivot table. So we have this one. Now, a pivot chart, you can create these at any time. First of all, if this were a regular set of data, in other words, if this were not a pivot table, if you highlighted this data here, and or if you clicked inside of it, I should say, and pressed Alt F1 to get a quick chart, you would pick up the grand total row and the grand total column, and all of this would appear in the chart. But Excel recognizes this as a pivot table. And so if you want to create a pivot chart instantly, you can simply by pressing Alt F1, and you'll have a pivot chart. And the reason it's not called a chart, but a pivot chart, is that within it, you're seeing labels a little bit different than you would normally. And recognize that the pivot table field list now says pivot chart fields. And instead of this area being called column, it's being called legend series. And down here, instead of row, it's called axis categories. Now, don't worry too much about the wording. Think of them as column and row. This is always in sync with the pivot table. And again, it's going to make for a crowded screen, particularly if you got slicers, but sometimes and we can say it with a certain kind of authority, there are times when a pivot chart just clears up everything, just as charts do sometimes. People have been overwhelmed with numbers, and sometimes a good chart tells the story faster and quicker and gets to the point, you might say. I would strongly suggest, too, if you work with pivot charts, recognize that it's got some of the same buttons you see when you work with charts on the Design tab. Now, recognize now we've got an Analyze tab, a Design tab, and a Format tab. We're now working with charts. On the Design tab, change chart type. I strongly recommend at least look at, not necessarily use, but look at stacked column, because it often simplifies the chart. Now, let's face it, that's a pretty small pivot table by most people's estimation. Pivot tables certainly often are small, but that's not a whole lot of information. And if we add just one more field to the pivot table, for example, just in year, which has only 2 variations in it, if I bring year and make it be a rows entry here, watch the pivot chart and pivot table both adjust. Now, I wouldn't say the chart's unwieldy yet, but you can begin to see that's not a whole lot of data in the pivot table, and yet the pivot chart's getting, maybe a little tricky to read. And it's a stacked example too. So we move it around here. And if we add one more field to that pivot table, I'm going to bring in the sales type here, and maybe I'll make it a legend series entry, the same as a column entry. We see what's happening there. And once again, the screen right now is just visual overload, to be sure. And maybe I'm exaggerating a little bit, but I think you can begin to see the whole issue with pivot charts is, depending upon the data and the complexity of it, sometimes it's that great accompaniment to the data that you want. At other times, it's just too busy. So you'll have to be the judge on that one too. I'm going to press Control-Z a few times to undo some of these actions and go back to a simpler view. Get things back to here and move this around. By the way, another way to create a pivot chart, but it will be on a separate sheet. I think fewer people would want it that way, but you can also press the F11 key. So with the active cell in a pivot table, press F11. You will get a new chart, but it's on a separate sheet. Now that may or may not be what you want to use. I tend not to, but still, that's viable also. It's a new sheet to the left of the sheet that has the pivot table on it. Okay. Now, what I was about to do, and this seems to be not an opportune break exactly, but I did want to move to a separate worksheet because we do want to talk about the ability to use timeline, and also to talk about how Excel handles information by date and time within pivot tables, because it is a great feature. And this worksheet here, I'm going to, first of all, I don't need that column, but get rid of that. This is about 400 rows as well, and we're tracking different salespersons here who make sales to different regions, and this is similar to some of the other worksheets, but a little bit different. And we're going to create a pivot table here right on the same worksheet simply by going to the Insert tab, choosing Pivot Table, and then in the lower portion of the Create Pivot Table dialog box, Existing Worksheet, click on the Location panel, and I'm going to click cell G1, and then OK. And I'll begin, as I have many times before, by clicking Salesperson because it's a text field. Reminder, it automatically goes into the rows area. If I click the box for a numeric field like units, it will automatically go to the values area. And I want to put region in here, but I do want it to go to columns, so I'll need to drag it there. OK. All right, a couple quick thoughts. We mentioned sorting in the last week's example, and I didn't refresh it or do anything new with that this time, but I wanted to bring this out as well too. Before we do that, as always, get rid of these column labels, row labels. We go to the Design tab and choose Report Layout, Outline, or Tabular. Okay. All right, imagine you're about to make a presentation of this, and you say, well, I just don't want to show international. And furthermore, maybe you've got a chart. So I'll press Alt F1, create a chart, and I'll go to the Design tab and make sure that's a stacked column. It's going to be easier to read. There we go. And zoom back a little bit so we can see all this. As I do this, the screen's going to move around a bit, as it does, unfortunately, and pull this chart down. So imagine I'm in a hurry, and I say, I don't want to show international, so I'm just going to hide column I. By the way, our grand total is over here to the right, 13,700. I'm going to hide column I, and almost immediately I think you can see that was probably not the wisest thing to do. If I'm going to make a presentation, first of all, somebody might recognize that there's a missing column I. Somebody else will say, I don't think those numbers add up to 13,000. Is something off, or am I wrong, or what? Well, no, they don't add up to 13,000. And furthermore, look at the chart. There's an international in there, so not a great idea. So let me undo that. Control Z a few times here. And what should we have done in a case like this? First of all, if we had slicers, we could do that. But if you don't want to emphasize that you even have the field there, you could use the drop arrow here for region and just uncheck international and click OK. And now there's no evidence of a missing column. The total is accurate for the numbers being displayed, and there's nothing here about international. And so what I'm getting at is, it's not that you're trying to be devious or deceitful or anything like that. You just don't want to show international for the moment, and it doesn't have to even enter the discussion. Fine, that's the better way to do it. Let me bring this back again, though, because there's some other aspects about how we display information here. You could, this would make more sense maybe, let's make international be off to the right here. Now, otherwise, from left to right, this is commonly done, east, midwest, southwest, okay, that's okay. But let's take international. Now, what we don't have to do is to highlight all of this. All we need to do is click the field name and drag its bottom edge rightward. And the I-beam indicator suggests what we're about to do. The data below, it's going to travel with it. So the 196 and the 533 right under international, they're being carried to the right also as we put it right there. And there it is. There's the 196, the 533. So you can move these fields around. You can also move rows up and down too. Herzl and Dunn work together, so I'm going to take Herzl's name here and drag this probably from the bottom. I think we can do it either way. Drag it up there and put it next to Dunn's name. So we can do that too, that sort of thing, as well as sorting. Now, without highlighting all this data, we can sort this by grand total simply by clicking out in column M anywhere and pressing the AZ button. You'll find that on the Data tab in the ribbon. Actually, ZA if we want it descending, ZA. So in other words, who's our top performer? Looks like it's Galt. So Galt's name is going to end up on top, and then after that it looks like it's going to be Ryan. So there we go, ZA. So we just sorted all of this data at once. Notice that the chart reacted as well too. And something unlikely, what if you said, I would like to take this data here and rearrange the columns left to right based on the grand total row? We can do that too. And we don't have to highlight the data. All we got to do is click down here in row 10 in one of these 5 cells here. Just click on one of these and we'll do a ZA right now. In other words, descending order left to right. So we're about to see in column H the Midwest region, and then South, and then West. There we go. So that's the higher number. This is the second highest, third highest. So we simply sorted these columns left to right, not by highlighting the data, but just clicking down here. So those are all nice features that you wouldn't exactly expect. Let me bring in another field again too. Well, let's bring in date first of all. Well, let me backtrack again. I sound like I'm double speak here. Let's suppose we wanted to analyze this data by date. Now, off to the left here in the source data, you can't, well, eventually you would see. This is data for 2012 and 2013, 2 years of data. Now, the new timeline feature introduced in Excel 2013 lets us look at it at a consecutive part of that time sequence. So, with the active cell in our pivot table, the Analyze tab in the ribbon, Insert Timeline. Pop-up tip, use a timeline to filter dates interactively. Timelines make it faster and easier to select time periods in order to filter pivot tables, so on and so on. It doesn't really say that it's got to be consecutive, though, and it does. So Insert Timeline here. And the only thing we can use, the only field that's available is date, so we'll choose that. And possibly you could put this above the pivot table. In other words, I could, right-click on row 1 and insert, and put in a few more rows up there. I'll press F4 rapidly, put in a few more, and maybe actually a couple more there too, and then just put this above it. Now again, that's not a requirement. I just think it might look better up there, and we can even shrink it a little bit this way. But this says months, and I think that's what we want to use. But notice we could use years. Now we only have 2 years, so we could choose 2012. And actually the timeline, there we go, 2012 only, 2013 only. Not so good there really. But for months and possibly quarters, we could do this. And we might want to make this wider. We could say, well, let's just show from July to June. In other words, not starting at the very beginning here. Now, sometimes you'll make this wider. When you click down here, for example, let's see. You know, I think what I might have done inadvertently is, let me go back again. I might have, let me go back to years here, choose years, and make sure we're seeing both years. There we go. And now, okay, choose months. So I might want to see just the data from July of 2012, starting there, over into June of 2013. So, and I think, let's see what's happening here. There we go. So through June, starting July through June. So we're only looking at a 12-month period, but it's the middle 12 months. What I'll do over here, make this row taller too. There we go. See that a little bit better. So now we've got a timeline. If we only want to focus on the first half of 2013, we'll take the left edge of our timeline, and instead of seeing 7,600 as our total down below, of course it's going to be quite a bit less. And now it's 3,600. So we're only viewing these months here. To my mind, I think this is a work in progress. I think it should get better. I like being able to do this. I might also like to do non-consecutive quarters. Now, there are ways to do that within a pivot table, but at least we see what we can do with this. We can change the extent of this. Take it out.
So Dennis, I have a question for you.
Yes.
And also, this would also be nice to have on the bottom of a dashboard so that the VPs or whatnot could actually alter what they're seeing visually without
right.
Yeah, so I think it's a great tool.
And you do have the ability to move it around too and shrink it. Now, if I shrink it here, I think, yeah, it doesn't shrink. In other words, it doesn't make the entries in here smaller. So you have to consider where you're placing it and making it wider. And I think the times I've used it seems to work better on top of the data rather than off to the right.
Okay. So here's my question. My understanding is if you save this in 2013 and you have your filters applied with the timeline, if you send that to someone who has 2010, they can open the workbook and the data will be filtered, but they are unable to change the filter. Is that correct?
I would think so. I haven't done that specifically, but the way upgrades have been handled in the past and how they work when you're going backward, that sounds as if that's the way it would work.
Okay.
Now, here's something interesting. What if I introduce a slicer here too? Now, I'm theorizing something might happen here. If I go back to the Analyze tab and insert a slicer here for date. Well, okay, that doesn't this way. I was thinking, what if I did it by month? But if I went in here somehow and started unchecking some of the January dates for 2013 by using the control key here, it effectively ignores me. In other words, the timeline is now showing everything, and what the filter, let's say that the timeline gets reset to show all months, because in the slicer here I'm showing everything except these 4 days. So you want to be a little cautious in using those together.
I have another question for you. Well, does this work the same on the Mac? And what is the possible video you're doing for lynda.com on Mac Excel?
The latest version of Excel for the Mac, 2011, and the rumor is that the Excel 2014 for the Mac might even be relabeled Excel 2015. It isn't out. But Excel 2011 for the Mac doesn't have pivot charts. I believe it has slicers. Actually, no, it doesn't have slicers either. I haven't used it in a long time, so I'd have to refresh my memory on that one. Have to check it. Timeline is not there for sure, and neither is pivot chart. So
there's a big difference. Hopefully, it's in the next version.
Everybody hopes so, yeah. And the rumor is that it's going to be closer to the Windows version than it has been in the past, but we'll see. Yeah. Okay. Anyway, getting back to the timeline, and I think using timelines and slicers together, there could be a way to use that efficiently. I'm just not sure. If our original source data had month as a column in it, then this would raise some interesting issues about how we use that. It looks as if slicer overrides the timeline, as it did here. So I'll delete the slicer in this case. Okay, now looking at this same data, and let's say we keep the timeline there, and for the moment we've got the chart here, busy screen, but let's say we want to analyze our data by date. So I'm going to remove salesperson from the pivot table. Of course, the chart reacts immediately. I'm going to click the box for date, and the chart looks ridiculous. And you could say the pivot table might look ridiculous too. At least it doesn't fit most people's idea of a compact entity that gives us a good, quick bit of analysis there. That just goes on and on and on. It did compact the data a little bit because on certain days there was more than one sale in different regions, like here, those 2 days and so on. But in the long run, that wasn't very helpful. Remember, all I did was to put the date field in the rows area of the pivot table. Now, in this example, the source data for date is simply date entries in column D. But look what we can do with it. I'm going to right-click one of the date entries. Let me also keep that chart in view, which for the moment is terrible. I'm going to right-click one of the, let me get this out of the way too. In column G, where we have our date entries, I'm going to right-click one of the dates and choose Group. And the pop-up suggests months. That sounds good to me. I'll just click OK. Months. And immediately, we've got a pivot table that's worth looking at. And the pivot chart tells us immediately June was our best month. Now, it does cover a 2-year period. So, for example, this is 2 different Januaries for our total. But maybe that tells us something about our business. Maybe it doesn't. But the grouping was amazingly fast and, need I say, accurate. There it is. We're seeing data by months. Now, I'm going to right-click on one of the months. Now, I could have done this the first time around when I right-clicked one of the dates. I could have chosen 2 or 3 fields. So going back to Group, and now, you don't need the Control key here, I'm going to click Quarters and Years, and then click OK. And now we see the data broken out this way. The chart maybe is questionable now. We do see that our 2 top months were June of 2012, and slightly behind that, March of 2013. We see that in the chart clearly, whereas looking at the numbers might take us a while. I'll move the chart off to the right a bit, reduce a little bit of clutter. Not a bad pivot table. As always, when you're working with pivot tables, is this for you, the analyst? Is it going to be printed and passed out to others? Is it a presentation? You're getting near that area where maybe it's too much information. So at different times, we give that some thought. Maybe we'll simplify this display. Now, here's the thought. If we want to experiment with years and quarters and month in here, first of all, we can make a quick change that's going to make readability better. We've got years, quarters, and the original field name in our data is called date. But to be in sync with the other information we're seeing on the screen here, why not change this to the word months? Make it plural like we see years and quarters as well. Now, within the pivot table fields, we don't see data anymore. We see months. Now, the original data is still unchanged, but and in the row areas down here, we see months. That makes it easier to work with. Now, instead of removing months from the pivot table field list completely, I'm simply going to take months and put it into the filters area. And when you put a field in the filters area, even though there's the timeline, I'm moving off to the right, putting it there and doing nothing with it essentially does what? You're just getting it out of the way. So let's say we don't mind the visual here, but what we got now is this. Now, let me make this a little more compact. I'm going to delete those top 4 rows or so. So now the question could be, and this would be before making your presentation, if this is where this is all headed, experiment with some of the different combinations. For example, putting in the rows area here, right now we've got years to the left of quarters. I'm going to put years below quarters in the field list, and that means in our list over here, quarters are to the left. Now, the advantage now is we are seeing, and it's an unusual layout, let's say, but we're comparing our 2 first quarter totals right next to one another. Certainly the more standard look would be to have years as the leftmost field. We can certainly do that again. But think of the possibilities. What if we bring in months here from the filters area and take out quarters? If we want to compare our 2 Januaries next to one another, we need to switch those 2 fields. So once again, in the pivot table fields list, we'll drag years below months. And now see our two Januaries right next to one another right there. Once again, if we have subtotals and don't want them, Design tab, left button, subtotals, do not show them. So all the variations here, and certainly not all of them are going to look good, but we've got a lot of possibilities here as we move around quarters, months, and years and temporarily move a field out of the way by putting it into the filters area, that's all. So I'll bring quarters back again. That would be a not very interesting display there probably. I'll put years above months back to here. Now, a while ago I had mentioned this idea on the Design tab, Report Layout, we do have Compact View. Compact Form is what it's called. Now this is the one that doesn't show the field names, and that's why I almost never use it. But the reason it's called Compact, and I'll use it right now, is that it makes the horizontal display here be more compact. In other words, it scrunches the data left-right. If I show this in compact form, it does that. And I don't really like the display anyway, and I do like grid lines, and I don't like row labels and column labels. So I'm not always that opinionated, but I don't like under report layout compact form. So I always choose tabular or outline. The main difference, outline does not show grid lines, tabular does, but there's another difference too that you might note. Let's imagine here, and I'm going to change the display again. Suppose I wanted quarterly totals here, and this might look, the point I'm about to make might look better if we just show years and quarters, or just yearly totals, for example. Okay, subtotals. Show all subtotals at bottom of group, on top. How about bottom? There they are. So that's a reasonable thing to want, I believe. For some people it's too crowded, other people, no, we want to see that. We want to see the yearly total there. Now notice the other option, subtotals. Show subtotals at top of group. I click it, it doesn't work. So what would be your conclusion? It's a bug, maybe. Well, it does work, and how would you ever know? But it only works, or let's say it doesn't work with tabular. It works with outline. So now we will see it if I switch to outline form. Totals on top. And we have the choice when we're using outline to put the subtotals on the bottom, like that, or to put them on top. But when we're using tabular, it's only on the bottom. That's it. So
how are people supposed to know that? That's not very intuitive.
They're not supposed to know it. It's not intuitive. It's 18 steps away from intuitive. No, it's just not there. Yeah. And those are the things that you would, why can't they say, for example, when you go to, that choice.
At least give a pop-up and say you need to do X, Y, Z, right? Maybe they'll fix that.
Yeah, they should. They should. Now, I want to point out a couple of other things here, too. As you work with multiple fields left to right, I mentioned this briefly in another context, but once again, I'll change this display so that we have years, quarters, and months left to right. And I want to not show the subtotals, makes it slightly less crowded. Do not show them. Now, in a display, this is 2 years. You can imagine, particularly if it's a live presentation, let's focus on 2013. We can either double-click 2012 or click the minus. I do double-click because that's the way it was in the past and it still works. This is going to collapse all this data here into a single row just by clicking the minus or double-clicking. There we are. It's all collapsed. Or we bring it back. So you can imagine at different times wanting to do that. Let's just focus on second and third quarters for both years. Let's collapse first quarter. Click that minus. Both first quarter lists have collapsed into a single row. Let's do it for second quarter. So these so-called outer fields, when you've got multiple fields on the left side of your data, this is also true in the columns area too, but on the outer fields, they give us the ability to expand and collapse. Double-click quarter 3. Now we're only seeing the detailed breakout for quarter 4. So by double-clicking or clicking the pluses or minuses, you can expand and collapse these as needed. And also, I click quarter 2, nothing unusual, but as I slide leftward, there's a black arrow. At some point, click it, and both sets of data for quarter 2 are highlighted. I'm clicking on August, Slide leftward, there's a black arrow. Click, both Augusts are highlighted. Maybe on the Home tab here, I'll make them yellow. And so as we change our display here in different ways, maybe I'll do this, move it around. The yellow is going to stay there in different ways, and it's going to follow. I mean, May is going to be highlighted no matter what we do here. I might even put months as a columns area field and bring region over here. That. So yellow's still there. We see it in different ways, and as we move the data around, it's still there, and it's happening. All the time while our charts in sync too. So there's all kinds of things like this that you can do that you just wouldn't expect. Now, what if this sales meeting, or these sales people here, what if they have a bi-weekly meeting? In fact, maybe they've been tracking their data for years on a 2-week basis, and they have 2-week meetings every 2 weeks, and they want to see the data as a 2-week breakout. So I'm going to right-click one of the regions here. Or actually not one of the regions, one of the years in the pivot table, and go back to group. And this time I'm going to check by clicking months, quarters, and years, and then group by days. And then below this it says number of days. I want this to be 14. Now this covers a 2-year period from 2012, and I would imagine you probably want to do these Sunday through Saturday. That would be a common way to do this. I want to group them by 14, and I'm going to start on January 1st, 2012, since that was a Sunday. I'd start with a Sunday probably, and end this with, even, I don't care what day of the week it is, but the 31st of 13th, there we go, the 31st of 2013. Now click OK. Now I've got that in the wrong, let me bring months over here. There we go. So now we've got a 2-year breakout. Remember, these are 2-week chunks, so we're going to have about 50 rows or so. And there it is, a few more, 54, whatever. So that's a 2-year period, but every one of these is a 2-week period, starting on a Sunday, ending on a Saturday for that period. So we can do that too. And even though this is a different worksheet, next worksheet over, which has time in it, we could quickly analyze our data here by time of day. In other words, what we might want to do here is say, what time of day do we have our best sales in? So what I'm going to do here, and relatively quickly, is simply choose Insert Pivot Table, Existing Worksheet, Location Panel. I'll click on cell H1, click OK, and I'll bring in Time down the left-hand side. And while I'm at it, I'll just click here and create a pivot chart, which will look ridiculous at first. Alt F1, pivot chart, and I want to track units sold. There we are. And again, chart's still ridiculous, but I'm going to right-click one of the entries for time. Right-click, group by hour. Hours, not months, hours. Our best time of day, the 3 o'clock time. There's our chart. There's our pivot table, not showing us any breakout otherwise. We could do it by salesperson or region or whatever. Bring in region maybe. More interesting probably. But we see at a glance what's going on. Here we would want to stack the chart again. Design tab. Change the chart type. There we go. So 3 o'clock time frame was by far our best. We're not sure why maybe. And toward the end of the day, between 6 and 7 was pretty good too. Anyway, we see the numbers out here, and we can see in the chart too what's happening. So we group the data by hours of the day. Do it that way. And you can do your own grouping. You could highlight these two together and group them and call it 8-10. Group these two and call it 10-12 and so on. In your own way, you can do that. Now, as we work with this data too, and I want to go back to, well, actually, we'd probably do it with our previous pivot table. Actually, I think this one is a bit too crowded, so I'm going to change this again and go back to grouping it by years, months, days. Back to group. Check days, so it's no longer selected. Then do months, quarters, years. And to make it a little bit more compact, take out months. Put it that way. Okay, so how about conditional formatting here? I want to know any month that went over 500. Now I see one there. Actually, I don't see. Maybe that's not a good break point. No, it's not. There's only one. Looks like. Or there's another one. Okay. How about anything above 400? I want those to stand out differently. So we're in a pivot table here. I'm going to go to the Home tab, Conditional Formatting, and create what's called a new rule. Excel recognizes this as a pivot table, and so here's a choice up here. Apply the rule to all cells that show sum of units values for quarters and region. That's it. And down here we can use different styles. Format style, a 2-color scale, we could use that. I could use data bars, maybe the 2-color scale, maybe icon sets even. The 3 traffic light pattern. Now, this is maybe going a little bit differently than what I said I was going to do, but let's try it this way first maybe. See how this is going to look. Use the 3-color pattern here. The greens are the top areas. Now, that represents not 1/3 of all entries, but the 3 entries that are in the top third based on the values. So those 3 are in the top, or the 3 highest. The reds are in the lowest, and the yellows in the middle, of course. Now, these will stay here as we manipulate pivot table fields, as long as they're both within our areas here. In other words, if I move region over to filters right now, we don't see those. We don't see our icons anymore. I put quarters up here in columns. We're not seeing those. I'm going to bring region back in now as a row entry, and now these return. So our 2 fields have to be within columns and rows to be seen. Now, if you remove region, if I were to drag it off or uncheck its box and then bring it back, that would not resurrect the buttons that we're seeing here, the icons. So you want to be a little bit careful how you use that. You can always reestablish it if you want to. But there's some real strong merit for this idea. And maybe the color idea would have been better. So I'm going to go back again to conditional formatting and manage the rule that's already been created. And edit the rule. And this time, instead of icon sets, first of all, I could use a formula instead. Now, the formula here, actually, I think I don't want to use that because it requires some backtracking too much. Let me back out of it for a second. We'll just cancel this and come back again. I want to edit the icon rule to be a little bit different. Edit the rule. And instead, try color here. And I think the problem here might be that it's going to use, even if I use a 2-color scale here. Yeah, this is going to just use continuous shading. There could be merit for this. I'll show it to you. I think it's not what I actually would want to do there, but you can see what's happening there. So the light color, the lightest color there by far is the best. The darkest color is the worst in terms of what we're seeing. Okay, what I need to do, and I should have thought this out ahead of time, but I think I've got it figured out. If I go back to conditional formatting here and simply clear the rules from this pivot table, and then highlight the data this way. Now the active cell right now is in I6. I think possibly that's going to make it relevant, but I'm not sure. New rule. And I'll use a formula. Equals I6 greater than 400. So if it's greater than 400, or 400, I'll make it greater than or equal to. 400 and up, let's make them be green. Fill green, and give it that bright chartreuse there, whatever. There we go. So those are the ones above 400, 400 and above. So all kinds of things we could pursue with this. And again, these 2 are going to stay in place. I'll flip quarters and region here, and the green's going to stay there. But if we take out one of those fields, move it into filters for the moment, the color's not going to be there anymore. Bring it back. And if we remove either region or quarters from the lower portion of our pivot table fields list and then bring it back. The colors will not come back until we reinstitute the conditional formatting rule all over again. Okay, we could go on and on and on. I think that's probably a stopping point. There probably are some questions.
One of the questions that's outstanding is a person wants to know if they can visualize the average of one field on the PV chart as a line chart. Does that make sense?
Well, first of all, within a chart, here's a chart here. I mean, we certainly, I'm not sure if this would be a good choice here. Well, okay, possibly. That does represent a time frame across the bottom. We can go to the Design tab in the ribbon, change the chart type. The fourth line option usually is the best one.
The person originally asked, is there a way that we can insert new series to the PV chart, say the average of one field? So that's the same person, same question. Do you need more information from that person, or is that good?
Well, I think I know what he or she's getting at, but let me see what we got here.
And while you're setting that up, I did want to let people know that if you go to, and I pasted the link, if you go to the part 1 of this series page on vbaexpress.com, at the bottom of the page you can download the workbook you're showing and the PowerPoint slides that you're not using, so they can download those and play with those. And if they have questions or if they want to hire you directly for their company or for one-on-one training, they can email you at dennis@excelandaccess.com. That's also been pasted. So if you have questions later, you can reach out to Dennis. He'll answer those for you. And if you think your company needs training and you'd like Dennis to come on site, you can discuss that as well.
I tried something kind of quickly here and it didn't work, but I wouldn't exactly say it's conclusive. But what I tried to do with this pivot chart here, as I could with a normal chart, you can highlight some data and copy paste it into a chart, and it appears there. Sometimes looking good, sometimes looking terrible. But I was not able to do that here. And again, I'm not sure if that's conclusive proof that we cannot do it, but I suspect maybe you can't do that later. Now, so again, not quite sure on that. You know, on the one hand, I want to say that there's so many things you can do with a pivot table, and yet I know there are things you want to do, you want to add on to it and say, well, why can't it do this, why can't it do that? And I, from time to time, feel some of that same frustration, but I'm still under the thrall of the way most features in pivot tables work quickly and easily, and we're not being overwhelmed with horrendous formulas or changing them. It's just, you know, it's kind of magical.
Dennis, I have a question for you. Do you have any other recordings of you doing presentations on pivot tables, and where would they be? Do you have those on lynda.com or?
I don't. Another author is doing those for lynda.com. I do them in the beginning course, and you probably recognize some of the data I use today. But although I'm altering it all the time. But no, I don't. Other than this.
Is this the only one? Okay.
Yeah, yeah.
And then are you going to do this topic for the CPE coalition?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Okay. Do you have anything else you want to go over, or I don't have any new questions coming in?
One other use here I might put in. You can add what's called a calculated field, and this opens the door to all kinds of things. What if we're showing this idea here? What if we're only showing 2012 here? So, or 2013. So let me, I guess it's not going to hurt to leave the green there, but what if we wanted to show, maybe we're at the sort of imagine we're at the end of the, or beginning of the calendar year, and these are last year's numbers, and you're having your first sales meeting for the new year, and you're saying, here's your goal for this year. This is what you sold last year. Let's put in a new set of data here, one for each of the regions here. There's a regional manager for each of these. So let's put in a new column that shows 10% growth. So active cells in here, in the pivot table. We go to the Analyze tab in the ribbon, Fields, Items, and Sets. Calculated field. We're going to add a field here, and that field is going to be based on a formula. equal units, and we can type it or insert it here, times 1.1. In other words, we want everybody to show 10% growth. Now, since the units that are involved in this example, even though we're not seeing them on the screen, are refrigerators and dishwashers and things like that, you can't have a tenth of a refrigerator or, you know, a half a television. So we'd have to round this. So equal round, left parenthesis, units times 1.1, comma 0. In other words, round it to the nearest whole number. So we're going to put in a new field here. Now, those numbers, well, here's one. That's the easiest one to know at a glance is if you're looking at 710, if that's going to grow by 10%, we'll be adding 71 to it. So that should jump up to 781. So we should see a number near here that's going to say 781. We're about to insert a new field. I'm going to take this formula here and copy paste it in a bit so you can see it larger. So I'm simply going to copy it right now. Okay, and then click OK. So we've got a new set of numbers. Now here's the 710, here's the 781. And we'd adjust the wording. So for example, here I might just say current.
How would you know it's a calculated field without, just by looking at it?
Oh, you don't. You don't.
Okay.
If I sent this to you, you wouldn't know that at first until you start looking at the field names and so on. So for this one, I'm just going to put in goal.
But doesn't a calculated field allow you to totally change a pivot table and make it much more complex?
Well, yeah. Yeah. And in this case, you can see what happens. So the green numbers, and that's left over from our previous formatting, but the green numbers are the current numbers, and the white numbers just to the right of them, it represents the goal, the rounded goal. So this is what you did in the year just finished. Here's what we expect you to do this year, at least. So, and as we click on these, we don't see anything anywhere that says that this is a calculated field, but it is. And in our pivot table field list, all we see here is a field 1. That's not exactly helpful.
Can you go back and edit that formula, or no? Once it's been...
That's my fault, because when I set up the pivot table, I didn't name it. I just went with the default that was field 1. But it could say, and you could make the,
forecast or whatever.
Yeah, you can make it meaningful, yeah.
But can you go back and edit that calculation, or no?
I could make it be 5%, for example. So I could... I believe, let's see, possibly do it by way of right-click. It seems like I should be able to get to it that way. Maybe value field settings. There's another way, of course, too, and go back to the way I had done it before, but actually I'm not seeing it this way. So I'll go back to Analyze tab, Fields, Items, and Sets, Calculated Field. And now it says field 2 right there, so I click the drop arrow and choose field 1. It seems to me like I should be able to change the name right there. But anyway, here's the formula, but instead of it being 1.1, I'm going to make it be 1.05. So how about 5%? And
is there a way you can have that calculated field pull a variable from a drop down on another sheet, say where you have percent markup?
I haven't done that, but I suspect you could.
So that way they could actually stay out of the pivot table once it's built, but it change it on the fly more easily.
I don't know. I'd have to try that.
Okay.
Now I'm going to try and change it and just put in goal. Now, since I'm already using that in the worksheet, I'm going to put in the goal. I'll put in 2015, even though we're not at the end of the year. See what happens here. Now, if I click OK here. Oh, it kept both of them, so I have to go back and get rid of the old one. So, yeah, here are the lower numbers. Here's the original number. Here's the 10% growth. Here's the 5% growth. So I want to go back and get rid of the one called this one right here. That was field 1. So weird. It seems like it didn't let me rename it. So I could go back up here to field items and calculated field and take out field 1. There we go. It's funny. There seems like there should be a way to rename that. Anyway, come back here, and now we'll just be seeing our 5% growth. There could be some aspects about that I'm not clear on in terms of how you track it down. So,
if I was still working in Excel, that's something I would explore fully. I think that just really makes it so much more powerful. You have the slicers, you have the pivot table, you have the timeline feature. It's a very dynamic tool, great for dashboards.
Also in this example here too, if I put, I'm going to move region and values here. Let's see. Yeah, that puts them together in one solid grouping to the left. So the green numbers are the current. So we've got this cluster of here with its total. Actually, it's right here. Yeah, those 5, and then our total, and then these 5 over here. Southwest International. Where's okay, Midwest. Okay, I'm not. Yeah, here we go. So now I have them side by side rather than interspersed. There is a way to get rid of the if you don't want to show the grand total column, or that's a grand total in there by if you right-click in here anywhere. You can't. Whoops. There we go. What's happening? No. If you go to PivotTable, I believe it's PivotTable options. Somewhere in there we can hide the grand total rows, I believe. Yeah, it's under here. Show the grand total for the rows. I said I don't want that. Or is it columns? Yeah. Yeah. Well, I got rid of the totals on I got rid of the wrong ones. But anyway, you can experiment with that a little bit. Some of these are available off the buttons on top too, and I haven't. Sometimes I fall back on right-clicking without even thinking. Some of these are available on the in the ribbon menu system too. You can also do, I mentioned too, you can do what's called ad hoc grouping. Let me first get rid of these totals here. Yeah, that's the totals I was thinking. If you said here's a pivot table here, and what if I were to simplify this pivot table to show region here? Here we go. So here's the situation. Somebody says, well, how well did we do in the east? We don't have an east. We got a northeast, northwest, southeast. So I'm going to take southeast here, drag it leftward so that it's adjacent to northeast, and then group these two on the fly. In other words, I want a single total here for east. It's going to be a little over 4,000. By dragging across these two and right-clicking and doing a group, and then collapsing them, I changed the name group 1 there right away to be east. There we go. But I can collapse it by double-clicking. So there's our east total, 4091. And certainly I do the same for the west if we did our groupings this way. So highlight those two in group, and then change this word in group 2 to be west. And then collapse that. So we've got the ability now, we've got a whole new display here of east and west with numbers we haven't seen before. In other words, we're creating new information off the source data. This is not in the source data, although it's based on it. And we can double-click here or click the plus to expand the west, do the same thing for east. And we really have a new field out there called Region 2. You might want to rename this. I might just call it E-W or something. So it's as if we've created a new field. And we got a new field out there. We got an east-west field, or an EW field, I guess, call it, and then we've got one called region. So we got 2 of them here. And in our display here, we don't necessarily have to show region anymore. Just show it this way. And we could do similar down here. We could group our kitchen items together, the dishwashers and refrigerators. Move those 2 together, probably top or bottom. Be able to drag dishwashers down here, and put televisions above refrigerators and so on. And we could group those 2. And of course, if we had more entries, it would make more sense. But we could group those and call them kitchen, and group the others or whatever, different ways. I think that's about it. There are all kinds of different examples based on the data that you're using. That's one of the things that probably can't really come through in a webinar or even in a live session if it's not your data that you're viewing. So remember, when you work with pivot tables, think of what you bring into the discussion. I almost said bring into the table. Think of what you bring to the table because you know your source data pretty well, or you often do. And then when you start manipulating fields by way of pivot tables, light bulbs go on. I mean, all kinds of things happen. It's an amazing tool.
Wow, thank you, Dennis. That was a great presentation, and I'm very grateful that you put aside this time today to go over this. Is there anything you'd like to say about future videos or anything that you're working on that you would like people to know about?
Well, do remember, if you want a quick look at some of my online work, you can go to lynda.com. It's lynda.com. Even if you misspell Lynda, you'll still get there. But I've got a number of courses out there. And also with VBA Express, the ones that you mentioned earlier, Christopher, and people are invited too. If you'd like to have me come to your site to do some training, I love doing that. I travel around the country a lot. I live in Colorado, but I've taught in 41 different states and a number of places in Canada too, and I like doing that. It keeps me fresh, and people do want to know about pivot tables. So when I was doing a lot of seminars on the road in 2006 to 2010, everybody seemed to want to know about pivot tables. That and VLOOKUP, the two biggies. So I think it's a great tool, and I hope these sessions have been helpful to you.
I've learned a few things, so thank you. And I think there's so much material. I think you probably want to watch these 2 or 3 times. This video recording will be up on VBA Express hopefully by tonight or tomorrow night. So please go back and watch those videos. And like I said, Dennis did a couple on formulas and functions, tips and tricks. You really are guaranteed to learn something. If you have questions, you can email either myself or Dennis directly. It's either Christopher@excellandaccess.com or it's Dennis@excellandaccess.com, and he'll answer your questions. And please download the copy of the workbook, the PowerPoint presentation, and please visit VBA Express and join the forums if you want to get answers to questions. There's some incredible minds there. They answer your questions for free. They answer them pretty quickly. So that's really all that I have to say, and we'll try to come up with some more webinars for you. I'm trying to get 2 on Power Pivot, which is a difficult topic, so I'm working on that right now, and hopefully Dennis will be interested in doing some more webinars in the future for VBA Express. So, and also, if you're a CPA and you want to get CPEs, email me and I'll send you the links to the 2 sites where Dennis does presentations. You can actually get, I think it's 1.5 CPEs for the same topic as today and the formulas and functions. So everybody have a great weekend. Thank you, Dennis. Once again, we really do appreciate your time and your sharing your knowledge.
All right. Thank you, Christopher, for setting this up.
Bye-bye.